Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. It's Bakari Lumumba, back once again, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we can gain a competitive advantage while always betting on Black. Back once again with a dual stream with Beacon Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, and the home of African-centered news and information. Have a great show today where we're going to be discussing, examining the Sahel Alliance and what it means for African people. And we have none other than the man, the myth, the legend, your favorite Pan-Africanist, of course, your favorite historian, and of course, my Pan-African big brother. And of course, so we're going to bring in the resident historian of course, Beacon Network in Lumumba Speaks, Brother Dwayne Omawale. How you doing this morning? This afternoon, brother?
Doing well. How you been?
I'm doing quite all right. So, we've discussed offline a couple of times about doing this show. We know that one of the critiques, unfortunately, regarding Pan-African circles, particularly here in the West, and even more in particular in the United States, is that we tend to only focus on issues that are germane to what African Americans or African people in America. This gives us a chance to have a more broader viewpoint and spectrum of course, what takes place in the African world. And so I think this is a great show to really kind of dive into some of the details and nuances of not only life on the continent. You've been blessed to be able to travel to the continent, as have I. Good afternoon, peace, brother Jamin. If you're watching, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Make sure you hit the notification bell as well. As you all know, you're watching the dual stream, once again, Beacon Network, and of course, LumumbaSpeaks.com. And so for those who may be unaware, when we talk about the Sahel is a region in Africa, biogeographical region in Africa. It is the transition zone between, of course, the Sudanian savannas to the south, and of course, the Saharan desert to the north. And so there are many countries that, of course, make up the Sahel, but we're focusing on the Sahel Alliance. And so, Brother Dwayne, many people may be unaware, right? The Sahel Alliance, as we know it, consists of three countries: Burkina Faso, we can argue the land that Thomas Sankara built, the country, the nation that Thomas Sankara built, of course, Niger, and of course, Mali. However, in 2017, the G5 put together a Sahel conference that consisted of those three nations, and of course, Mauritania and Chad. What is the difference between the G5 Sahel conference that was put together in 2017 and, of course, the alliance of 2023?
A big difference, So in the first place, the one that was put together in 2017, that wasn't a purely African initiative, and what I mean by that is it included organizations and nations outside of Africa. I was looking through it and I saw Japan, was a observing member. Tony Blair Institute was involved in it as well. The European Union has been involved in it. So more or less, it's a similar type of initiative that we've seen where foreign elements, foreign governments and institutions and organizations are essentially putting together what they believe is a developmental initiative for Africa. So what was put together in 2017 was more or less the same of what we typically see in Africa. That's African development being dictated by people outside of Africa. Whereas the more recent alliance, one of the reasons why it's excited a lot of optimism is the fact that it was actually put together by African people. It was, it's an alliance of African states that are deliberately coming together to secure their own interest rather than being something that's put together by foreign elements who are seeking to dictate to Africans how we should go about navigating our development.
So would you argue that the alliance came to fruition as a way of trying to, of course, rid itself of neocolonial influences?
Yes, and it's not just an argument I would make, but I think the leaders of the alliance have made it very clear that they're trying to move Africa in a new direction, particularly when we think about the French colonial influence in Africa.
Yes.
All three states have been very outspoken about the fact that they're trying to rid the French neo-colonial influence and other influence as well. In Niger, for example, they've essentially kicked the American military presence out of that nation. So essentially what these states are doing is, as I pointed out, they're trying to chart their own development rather than having foreign outsiders dictate to African people the path that needs to be taken for development.
Okay, very good, very good. What does the Creation Alliance say about the efficacy of ECOWAS? And many of you are unaware, ECOWAS is an acronym for the Economic Community of West African States. We do know that there is an ECOWAS passport now, right? So many argue that this is a step towards Pan-Africanism. However, some would argue, and of course the Sahel Alliance members have argued that ECOWAS is being influenced by the West as well. Some have even argued, maybe even inferred that it's being funded by the West, and that ECOWAS, in the same light as the African Union, is what many would consider possibly a toothless bulldog.
Yeah, I think that would be a very accurate critique of ECOWAS. The problem with ECOWAS, and I would even extend this critique to the African Union and many governmental bodies that are supposed to represent Pan-Africanism, is that it's Pan-Africanism in theory, but rarely is it Pan-Africanism in practice. You know, the Sahel Alliance is really bringing out these issues with ECOWAS because, you know, the first issue was that when these states were trying to develop a more independent approach, ECOWAS had essentially suspended the membership because ECOWAS takes a very strong position against military coups, military regimes, and that's true. But the critique of that is it's very hypocritical because you know, for years I've been a very strong advocate for the revolutionary struggle in Togo, and the issue in Togo is that essentially Togo has a military regime, that the current president was installed by the military in 2005. The only difference is outwardly it's given the appearance of being a civilian government because, you know, every so often there are elections, even though the elections have a lot of irregularities. But essentially you're looking at a government that was put in place by the military, and the current president was put in place in 2015 by 2005 by the military. His father was the prior president, and he came to power in a military coup. So you're talking about a military regime extending back to the 1960s in Togo. And why I mention that is ECOWAS is willing to tolerate that situation because of the outward appearance or the facade of a civilian government. But the issue with Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali is that these are outwardly military-led regimes. So that was the first issue that, you know, ECOWAS stepped in and suspended membership in those for those nations. And then the issue became that when it was apparent that these nations weren't going to change their trajectory because of pressure from ECOWAS, ECOWAS has now tried to switch position. ECOWAS is now trying to get those states to rejoin ECOWAS. But as you'd imagine, you know, when ECOWAS took such a strong position to, you know, essentially threaten these states or to intimidate these states into changing direction to rejoin ECOWAS, when that didn't work, it essentially created a situation where now, you know, these states are looking at ECOWAS as they can't necessarily trust ECOWAS because ECOWAS is not sympathetic to what these states are trying to do. ECOWAS is essentially playing the role of trying to intimidate and bully these states into changing direction. And now it isn't working. ECOWAS is trying to adopt a new approach. ECOWAS is trying to be more facilitating towards these states, trying to bring these states in. Actually, the new president of Senegal, Faye, he's been tasked with you know, trying to bring these states back into ECOWAS, and I think the reason why they put that objective on him is because he's you know, a very new president, you know, recently elected, very young president as well, and he came to power utilizing similar type of Pan-African rhetoric and a Pan-African vision that's also, you know, been made very popular by the Sahel states. So I think what we're seeing with ECOWAS now is a bit of a change of direction where ECOWAS is trying to present itself as being more sympathetic to the Sahel states and trying to present itself as being more aligned with a type of anti-colonial Pan-African vision. But because of ECOWAS's recent history and the lengthy history of ECOWAS and the type of people who've been in charge of ECOWAS, there's obviously a lot of skepticism of ECOWAS, not only on the part of the states that make up the Sahel Alliance, but a lot of optimism just on the part of ordinary citizens in West Africa. You know, as I pointed out, the situation with Togo, it tends to give the perception that you know, ECOWAS might claim that it wants, you know, stability and democracy and those sort of things, but really what it wants is just the facade of stability, the facade of democracy. Is perfectly, you know, willing to have dictators as member states. You know, just, you know, the issue is that as long as these dictators present a certain image and go along with a certain type of politics, and that politics is very much neo-colonial. It's not something that really threatens the status quo in West Africa. So given the history of ECOWAS, there's a lot of skepticism towards what ECOWAS is doing and what it represents, and on the other end of that, because what the Sahel states are doing, that's generating a lot of optimism and excitement, because it seems to be a type of Pan-African vision in West Africa that's moving towards a more anti-colonial type of perspective, and the type of perspective that really centers Africa first and foremost, rather than centering the dictates of foreign entities.
Right. So that's a great point. You talk about generating excitement. That leads me to think of Gaddafi. We talk about maybe almost a decade and a half ago. There was a lot of excitement that was generated from, of course, or many would argue, the Pan-African efforts of Muammar Gaddafi, the former Libyan strongman, as some would say. Um, in what ways is the Sahel Alliance similar or different from the goals of Muammar Gaddafi? And I asked that question, and I was able to do some cursory reading. And one of the goals of the Sahel Alliance was to create a central currency amongst those member states.
Yeah, that's I mean, I could go back to Togo. Togo's problems actually started when the first president, Sylvanus Olympio, tried to do the same thing. Olympio was trying to create an independent currency for Togo, and the French weren't happy about that, so they orchestrated a coup, which resulted in his assassination. So again, going back to the 1960s, going back to the initial independence movements in Africa, the initial anti-colonial movements in Africa, the movements led by people like Sylvanus Olympio, that's always been an effort that Africa has been striving towards, this effort of actually creating an independent currency for African states, rather than something like the CFA franc that we see in the Francophone African states. That's a currency essentially controlled by France. So, you're right that a big part of the excitement that people had about Gaddafi and his Pan-African efforts is also similar to what we see in the Sahel states. This effort of creating an independent currency for Africa, something that's not controlled by foreign entities. And again, when I talk about Pan-Africanism, part of what frustrates a lot of people on the continent with Pan-Africanism, as I pointed out, these institutions that engage in Pan-Africanism and rhetoric, but the practice is never a type of anti-colonial Pan-Africanism. It's never a type of Pan-Africanism that's trying to lead African people away from the control of foreign entities. And that was a lot of the appeal that Gaddafi had. Gaddafi was, for many decades, seen as a very anti-imperialist figure, a very anti-colonial, anti-capitalist figure, because he stood up to the West. So much so that under Ronald Reagan, there was even an attempt to assassinate Gaddafi. So what we see with the Sahel states is a similar type of viewpoint, that these are leaders who are anti-Western, and because of their position, they're opposed by the West. Now, something that we've spoken about is, I think we do need to be very cautious about, the fact that simply because the West is against a certain leader, that doesn't necessarily mean that what the leader is doing is effective, or that we necessarily need to support.
Very true.
And I think a similar argument could be made about Gaddafi as well, that simply because the West opposed him doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't problems with certain things that he did. So I think that's an important point to make clear. But in terms of that connection, I think with these leaders, in Africa, we're seeing for the first time in a long time, perhaps for the first time since Gaddafi, we're seeing leaders who are actually willing to stand up to the West and to chart a Pan-African vision that's not connected to the West, that appears to be more independent.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this question: can the alliance actually address the material conditions of African people? For example, the Sahel is one of the most resource-rich areas of the African continent. However, it's one of the most impoverished. Can they address the material conditions of the people, and if so, how?
Well, you mentioned Thomas Sankara. I think Thomas Sankara provided, perhaps, this is an argument I would make, that Sankara provided the best model for how we go about doing that. And Sankara's model was, first and foremost, a model of development that was completely centered on the needs of the masses of the people of Burkina Faso. So many of his policies were things that were directly related to the issues that people in Burkina Faso were dealing with. And not only were the policies centered on the needs of the people, but it was carried out in a very practical way. And what I mean by practical is, he started with actually reducing salaries for ministers in the government, reducing certain privileges and benefits that came with being in government. And why that's particularly important, and we see this, for example, in a country like Kenya, that typically African governments, when they're trying to reduce the debt and implement austerity measures, it starts with the masses. So it means cutting subsidies for ordinary people. It means putting taxes on ordinary people. Sankara started by putting the burden of austerity on the government, on himself. Sankara actually, when he was assassinated, was not very wealthy. Blaise Compaoré and the people involved in that conspiracy put out information that Sankara was amassing all types of wealth and that sort of thing. But when what we really found out after he was assassinated is that he didn't own very much in his own name. I think there's a documentary called Thomas Sankara, Upright Man, and they mentioned he had I think a few guitars and maybe a broken refrigerator, but he wasn't very wealthy by any means. He didn't have a lot of material possessions, so it was very deliberate. His view was that members of the government should carry the burden that they're trying to carry the burden of the masses rather than imposing that burden on the masses. And the other thing that he did that was very practical and effective as well is actually implementing policies that addressed particular needs. So for example, food insecurity. Thomas Sankara focused a lot on making sure that Burkina Faso was food self-sufficient. Yes. He pointed out that Burkina Faso had enough resources to feed everybody, and that the only reason why people in the country were starving was because of the fact that the country had been poorly organized. Another thing that he did was advocating for local industry. So, one of the things that Thomas Sankara implemented is that members of the government had to wear clothing that was made locally by the people of Burkina Faso, to the point where he was able to brag before the Organization of African Unity that the clothing he wore, every stitch of it was every fiber of the clothing was stitched in Burkina Faso. So those were the measures that Thomas Sankara implemented, and I think those can be and should be replicated. We should have African leadership who's willing to self-sacrifice to meet the needs of the people, African leadership that's willing to promote local industry, willing to promote food self-sufficiency, and those sort of things. Now, the biggest issue or the biggest difference between what Thomas Sankara was doing in the 80s, and I think the challenge that these current states in the Sahel Alliance are going to be confronted with, is the fact that Thomas Sankara was not dealing with the type of Islamic extremist insurgency efforts that these states are dealing with now. So in Sankara's situation, there wasn't the same degree of internal pressures in terms of the violent nature of what we see these groups doing. For example, anyone following the news in Burkina Faso, that every so often you see stories about villages being attacked by these groups, large scale massacres, killing a large number of people in these villages. This was not an issue that Sankara had to deal with. So my particular concern with the Sahel states and how this might impact their ability to address these concerns is so much time, energy, and resources are going to obviously be going towards fighting these extremist groups. And I think that does take away a lot of time and effort towards building and sustaining the type of policies that these nations need for development. And I mean, a historical example I could give is Mozambique. After Mozambique became independent, the West, essentially fostered a counter-revolutionary effort in Mozambique, and the nation was devastated by years of civil war, and it's something that Mozambique is still struggling to recover from. So I say that to say that civil wars can be very devastating for nations. It's the type of thing that might take several decades sometimes for a nation to recover from. So the concern that I have with the Sahel states and their ability to engage in the type of development that they need is just, as I pointed out, the type of energy, time, and effort that will obviously go towards fighting these extremist groups takes away from the effort and the energy needed to actually build that development. So I think they can do it, but my immediate concern is just the military constraints imposed by the need to fight these groups.
Absolutely. And Brother D1 Beats, happy you're watching, family. And if you're watching, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. You're watching a dual broadcast with LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. And of course, the Beacon Line Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, the home of African-centered news and information. And we're here with, once again, the man, the myth, the legend, the resident historian here at Beacon Line Network, and of course, Lumumba Speaks, and of course, your favorite Pan-Africanist, and your favorite historian, Brother Dwayne Omawale. Brother D1 has a comment. He says, a concern I have is a potential reversal of these coup like what happened to Sankara due to existing French interests in these regions. So that is something, of course, that we want to be cognizant of, keep an eye on. Snapshot review says, how does the everyday African earning less than 60,000 a year tap into or take advantage of the Sahel Alliance to help us progress wherever we are in the globe?
The everyday African, but I think that is one of the current limitations of the efforts of the Sahel states, that obviously it's an alliance between these states. So to be honest, when you're saying everyday African, if you're talking to Africans outside these states, they might not necessarily be able to directly take advantage or benefit from the efforts of these states. But why I keep stressing the sense of optimism that these states are generating is that even though everyday Africans outside of these nations may not necessarily be able to benefit from what these states are doing, it could very well set an example for other states to follow. And I mentioned Senegal. Senegal is an example where the leader there, I wouldn't make the argument he's as revolutionary as what the leaders of the Sahel states are. He's I think Faye in Senegal is more of a reformist, but just the fact that he was elected into power and the government of Senegal has more of an anti-colonial position than the prior administration did, to the point where France is actually scaling back its military presence in Senegal. So I think what will happen with the Sahel states is, if this continues to spread, we might see more nations in Africa adopting positions that are more anti-colonial, positions that are more Pan-African. As I pointed out, even though Senegal is currently a bit more moderate than what we're seeing in the Sahel states, is still, I would argue, a step in a more positive direction. So, to me, I think that's how it would impact everyday Africans. That if this continues to spread, it could set an example across the rest of the African continent. And to D1 Beat's point, obviously, that is always the concern. And then it was the particular concern with Thomas Sankara, that once these examples begin to spread, it becomes a threat, and then that's where foreign entities tend to step in and do what they can to subvert or engage in counter-revolutionary measures to overthrow these type of efforts.
Absolutely. I think if we take a lesson from, of course, Thomas Sankara, one of the issues, but he would state in speeches that if I am the only one doing this, I'll be deleted in less than a year. And so I think one of the issues of concern was that he was acting almost unilaterally. He didn't have any assistance. But we see now, at the very least, we have 3 nation states who are working together. And so that should be able to, in my opinion, provide a buffer or insulate them from some of the foreign pressures to destabilize what they're seeking to build. Any thoughts on that, Brother Dwayne?
Yeah, I agree, and it's something that we continue to struggle with, and not just in Africa, but throughout the diaspora. I mean, even in the United States, I've often made the argument that I think the Pan-African movement in the United States is still struggling to recover from what COINTELPRO did in the 60s and 70s. Yes. I don't think we've ever really fully been able to recapture the level of mass mobilization and organization that we had during that time period, and it was a very deliberate attempt to undermine those movements. So that is something that is always a cause of concern for African people, something that we need to keep an eye out. And I think the Sahel states, I think they understand very well the fact that there are certain international pressures that are being imposed on them, not just from ECOWAS, but from Western states. And I think the states are very cautious about any type of counter-revolutionary activities, which is another cause of concern that I have, that historically we've seen how nation states that have to take certain measures to protect themselves from counter-revolutionary activities, particularly if they're already military regimes to begin with, that could very easily become a type of oppressive authoritarianism that could also undermine the efforts of what these states are trying to do. An example that I've written about is Sekou Touré in Guinea. I've made the argument that I think he definitely came to power as somebody who had an anti-colonial vision for Guinea and for Africa. But the issue was, because of so many assassination attempts against him, because of so many counter-revolutionary attempts against him, what ended up happening in Guinea was he created a very dictatorial, oppressive, and this was done in the name of protecting the revolution in Guinea. But unfortunately, the people who suffered the most from protecting the revolution were ordinary citizens in Guinea, who had to bear the brunt of these oppressive policy. So I think that's always a concern as well, that we have to find a way to balance being able to protect against counter-revolutionary measures, but without going to the extreme of actually harming the revolutionary effort itself by becoming too dictatorial.
Great point, great point. So let me ask you this question. Is the Sahel Conference a step toward Pan-Africanism, or will this alliance lead to regional conflict?
I think if it does lead to regional conflict, it would essentially be because ECOWAS or certain entities or states that are funded by the West would step in and engage in a conflict with the Sahel states on the behalf of the West, or on the behalf of whoever has an interest in destabilizing these states. But if that were to happen, I think it would ultimately be a benefit for Pan-Africanism, in the sense that, as I pointed out earlier, the Sahel Alliance has more or less exposed the fact that ECOWAS is not a type of genuine grassroots-centered Pan-Africanism. So, to me, I do see it as a benefit for Pan-Africanism, in the sense that not only is it a union of African states that recognize that some form of international unity among African people is needed, because we confront similar issues, we have similar enemies, and I think that's the part of the understanding behind the Sahel Alliance, that these states are all dealing with, as I pointed out, a similar issue of Islamic extremism. So they're dealing with similar issues, and not just the issue of Islamic extremism, but the issue of neocolonialism, the issue of the French colonial presence. They recognize they're dealing with the same issues, so it's to their benefit to create this alliance. It's in their benefit to unify for that purpose. But the other part of what they're doing is, as I pointed out, they're exposing the fact that so many of the leaders in West Africa, so many of the leaders across the continent that preach Pan-Africanism aren't engaging in what we would see as a genuine Pan-African effort. They're not engaging in the type of Pan-Africanism that really will lead to the advancement of African people. So I think it will be a benefit for Pan-Africanism ultimately. And if it does result in any type of adverse action against these states, it'll just further prove the point that any type of effort to build a genuine Pan-African movement will be met with hostility from Western colonial powers and from African states that are aligned with these Western colonial powers. And I think a good part of why I think these states are already getting the support that they're getting is because of the backlash they've been getting from the West and from ECOWAS. I think people across Africa, people across the diaspora who are very serious about Pan-Africanism are starting to recognize that when we build these genuine, as I pointed out, these genuine Pan-African movements, this is the type of response that's to be expected. And as I pointed out, I think it's generating optimism, because I don't get the sense that people are discouraged by the type of obstacles that the Sahel states are encountering. I think it's very inspiring to people to see that these states are still moving forward with their efforts, even though they are currently experiencing pushback and attempts to subvert what it is that they're doing. So it's to me, it's very important for Pan-Africanism to see not only an initiative like this, but to see an initiative like this moving forward and not compromising even in the face of the obstacles that they're dealing with. I think far too often we're too accustomed to people who claim that they're Pan-Africanists but compromise in certain ways that tend to subvert or undermine the Pan-African movement.
I think that's a great point. Now, we're going to kind of pivot just a little bit. This is something that we've talked about previously on, of course, our broadcast. And you kind of even touched on it just a little bit earlier in terms of the three nations, of course, that are members of the alliance. The heads of state came via military coups. Should there be concern that these member nations are led by military juntas?
Yeah, I think that's one of my biggest concerns, and the reason why that's a concern of mine is because I think military regimes inherently have a type of fragility, to them, and what I mean by that is when the military comes to power by seizing that power away from the government, it creates what it does is it sets a standard. So this is why in African states that have had a history of military coups, it continues, because once you open up the possibility that the military can seize power whenever it wants, it makes it very difficult then to resolve that problem, and it just creates a culture of continuous military regimes. And all three of these states, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, have a history of military coups. These current governments are not the first time the military has seized power in these countries. So my immediate concern is, hopefully because these nations, all three of them are talking about an eventual transition back to civilian rule. So my hope is when that happens, we finally have a more stable civilian government. Otherwise, it'll just be a continuous cycle of more military regimes. And as I pointed out, it does create a culture in nations that have this problem, that's just a continuous cycle of these a continuous cycle of the military, stepping in and seizing power, because that example, that model has already been set. So I think that is a concern I have, just the issue of the lack of stability that comes with military regimes. And as I pointed out as well, also the concern of military regimes stepping too far. I think with these three states, they've so far managed to avoid the type of horrendous abuses that we often tend to see with military regimes in Africa, such as the example of Togo that I gave. But the concern is, if the military is in power and there's no oversight, what is preventing these regimes from slipping into that type of authoritarianism? What's stopping these regimes from slipping into horrendous human rights abuses? So that's also the issue with military regimes and why they tend to lack stability, because there's really no civilian oversight. It's essentially the military seizing power and the military policing itself, and that could be very ripe for abuses. That's essentially the situation that happened with Thomas Sankara, that when he was in power, it was still a military regime, and because of the lack of a civilian oversight, what happened was a counter coup against him. And why the civilian oversight is important is because when the military is in power, if there's a split within the military that's running the country, those splits then wouldn't go before the masses of the people in the country to be resolved that way. Those splits will typically be resolved internally within the military, and oftentimes that results in violence. So I do think with military regimes, there does need to be a space where ordinary citizens do have a voice within the day-to-day governance of what's happening. And the third point that I will mention that I think is also important as well, when we think about Africa, that military regimes, I would argue, are not African, because the vast majority of traditional African states did not even have a standing military. So the military as an institution of power is not even something that emerged within African culture. Most African states, as I pointed out, did not have standing military regimes. So I think part of the problem too is that the military institution is something that emerges out of the legacy of colonialism, out of the legacy of using force, oppressive force, to sustain a state. So as I pointed out, I think there does need to be a transition to a civilian government, and it needs to be a type of civilian government that sustains the stability needed in the country, a type of civilian government that also includes the masses, the ordinary people in day-to-day governance, and a civilian government that's ultimately not going to seek to govern through force or through intimidation, as is often the case with military regimes.
I think those are some great points. What are your thoughts or concern regarding if there is a transition to civilian rule, that the civilian, of course, democratically elected leader, put democratically in air quotes, could be influenced by the West to be counter-revolutionary in their policies?
That's a possibility as well. And one of the challenges with civilian rule in Africa is precisely that there's so many foreign forces and foreign influences that it wouldn't take a whole lot for the West to step in and to exercise power or influence or control in one way or the other. And that's why some African states feel the need to establish a strong military presence as a counter to Western influence, because typically what the West will do is, as we pointed out, the West has a history of overthrowing African states or destabilizing African states. So a strong military presence has always been needed to be able to counteract that. So I think with the transition to a civilian government, my hope would be it wouldn't be the type of transition where the civilian government is essentially falling back into the old practices of not being aware of the external threats that are posed to African states. So my hope is that even though it's a transition to civilian government, the civilian government is still very much vigilant about destabilization efforts.
Okay. Very good. So, family, what we're going to do now is we're going to open up the conversation. I'm going to put the link in the chat. The link is also in the description if you're watching, family. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. You're watching LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black, and Beacon Line Network, the Pan African social media extraordinaire in the home of African centered news and information. And we're having a discussion, a serious discussion, about examining the Sahel Alliance and what it means for African people. And of course, we could even add on to that, is this a step towards Pan-Africanism? So, family, the link is in the chat. The link is in the description. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button, thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up, as well as the notification bell. We have a question from Snapshot Reviews. I think you're tapping in all the way from Jolly Old London. So the question is, could they qualify for BRICS membership? And if so, what would that be a good idea?
I don't know if they would qualify. I'm not, familiar what the qualifications for BRICS membership would be. In terms of how beneficial it would be, from what I know of BRICS and what BRICS is trying to do, it's not the issues that the Sahel Alliance is still confronting. They would have to confront those things even with a BRICS membership, because from my understanding, I think that's more of like a monetary alliance. It's more of an alliance done for trade and financial purposes. I don't think it's a military type of alliance, and I'm not as familiar with BRICS, but from what I know of it, I don't think it's a military alliance. So why I mention that is the Sahel states, part of why they're forming the alliance that they're forming is not only for financial reasons, but for actual protection. As I pointed out, all of them are dealing with similar types of issues with instability coming from certain extremist groups. So there's a military consideration, and also the threat of foreign intervention as well. So I don't know if they would qualify for BRICS, and I don't know if the mission of what BRICS is trying to accomplish would necessarily be beneficial to protecting the Sahel Alliance.
So got a great question coming up from Mr. Sandman. He says, I'm confused. Wasn't Russian arms dealers causing civil wars in Africa? Why are the Sahel Alliance purchasing weapons from Russia again?
To answer that is, historically, a lot of African states, when they're fighting against the Western imperialist powers, have had to turn to Russia because, the thing with Russia and Russia's policies in Africa, Russia wasn't among the states in Europe that were engaged in the slave trade, nor did Russia have any colonies in Africa. And given the historical legacy of the Cold War, given the historical legacy of the clash between Russia and Western colonial powers, African states that have been fighting against Western imperialism have often had to turn to Russia as a convenient ally in the struggle against colonialism. And part of that has been a strategic military alliance where they get training, weapons, and funds from Russia to accomplish what it is that they need. And we see the same thing happening with the Sahel Alliance, that because of the state of poverty and underdevelopment of these states, it would be very difficult for them to accomplish everything that they're trying to accomplish on their own, in terms of not only fighting against these extremist groups, but also to engage in the type of development that these states need, and also to guard against efforts by the West to subvert the efforts that they're engaged in. So I think for the Sahel states, and historically for the states that have taken assistance from Russia, including arms, it's always been a situation where you do need the backing of a strong superpower. You do need the backing of some type of ally to help you fight another superpower. And I think that's what the Sahel states are doing. That's what a lot of anti-colonial movements in Africa throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s were doing, taking arms, taking whatever support they can get from Russia to secure their own interest. And even though I do think there are certain causes of concern that we need to look out for with Russia, because history will show that Russia, when they intervene in Africa, so often to secure Russia's own interest. That Russia is not in Africa for altruistic reasons. That Russia does have its own agenda. Historically, that's always been the case. But I think for African states who are fighting against colonialism, it's often been easier to trust Russia because of the fact that Russia's history, where Africa's concern, has not been as destructive and exploitative as the Western colonial powers has been.
And could you provide some examples of some of those historical reasons that Russia has had an interest in Africa?
So particularly during the Cold War, that was more of an ideological clash between Russia and the United States. So the Soviet Union had a big interest in spreading its Marxist Leninist ideology. So what we find is that the Soviet Union was providing a lot of aid and a lot of support for African revolutionary struggles that adopted a Marxist Leninist ideology. So the reasoning behind that was to secure Russia's place in the ideological struggle against the West. I think in a more contemporary setting, we still see that that clash, and even though it's not framed in the same type of ideological terms as it had been during the Cold War, Russia's no longer presenting itself as a communist nation. There still is a clash over dominance, and there still is a clash over who essentially will be the dominant superpower in the world. Will it continue to be the United States, or will Russia and China and other nations essentially supplant the United States as being the dominant superpower? So for Russia, and I would include China in this as well, I think Africa is of great strategic influence, and not only because of the resources in Africa, but the fact that I think the world is starting to recognize that Africa is possibly an emerging power, because Africa does have the resources. Africa has a very young population. Africa is said to have very large population growth as well. So there are a lot of opportunities moving forward in Africa, and I think Russia and, as I pointed out, China. I think for them, they're looking to secure their place in Africa's development and Africa's future, and essentially trying to push out those forces that had control and domination over Africa, which is the United States and the Western powers in Europe.
Okay, very good. Well, family, once again, you're watching. The link is in the description. The link is in the chat. We're having a conversation regarding examining the Sahel Alliance and what it means for African people. You're watching a dual stream with themovementspeaks.com, Black Empowerment Initiative, where we believe we could gain competitive advantage by always betting on Black. And of course, Beacon Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire. Tap in, be part of the conversation. As we discuss not only what we can learn from this, what are some issues of concern as well. But Dwayne, who of course is the resident historian here at the Movement Speaks, the Beacon Network, shared that this could be a platform. This could be a situation in which African people globally are able to look at what's being done in the Sahel Alliance and then, of course, replicate what's being done to the benefit of African people. And we know that part of the goal, of course, of Pan-Africanism, even revolution, is to address the material needs of the people, right? And that's one of the reasons why the Cuban Revolution was so successful. So just something, of course, to be cognizant of, that when we philosophize and have these intellectual exchanges, part of the goal is to make sure that we are able to develop a way to address the material needs of our people at home and abroad. So, Brother D1, I see you're there. Make sure you tap in. Snapshot Reviews want you to tap in as well. Mr. Sandman, you can do the same. If you're new to the channel, of course, make sure you hit the thumbs up button. Hit that subscribe button as well, and the notification bell. Tap in and be part of the conversation where we're having, of course, this is home of Pan-Africanism here. Dual stream, but Beacon Network, and of course, themovementspeaks.com. So any other thoughts, Brother Dwayne, that you think we should be aware or cognizant of when we talk about the Sahel Alliance, and of course, what it means for African people?
Not that I could think of immediately. We actually covered a lot more ground than I was expecting, but I just wanted to reinforce that for myself as a Pan-Africanist and for a lot of other Pan-Africanists, it is something that is generating a lot of optimism and hope, because not only is it a Pan-African initiative, but as I pointed out, it's anti-colonial in nature, and it's something that seems to be rooted in the actual interest of African people, as opposed to a type of Pan-African initiative that is Pan-African on the surface, but is being promoted and pushed by people on the outside who are trying to dictate to African nations what it is that we need to do. So it is very very encouraging to see African states, as I pointed out, take these positions and hold the line. Not be intimidated by what ECOWAS is doing, not being intimidated by the United States or by France or by any other nation. So it's in terms of Pan-African states in Africa, it's been a while since we've seen states that were led by leaders who took such a strong position. As you pointed out, Gaddafi was a leader like that. Robert Mugabe as well, although I do have my issues with certain aspects of how he ran Zimbabwe.
I think everybody has issues with how you ran the government.
Yeah, but that's something that a lot of people admired about Mugabe. That Mugabe held the line, and no amount of intimidation efforts by the West caused him to compromise. So I think, if for no other reason, it is important to have examples and models of African leaders who are willing to take those positions and to be uncompromising.
Absolutely. So snapshot reviews, SSR for short. What were the main events that led to each of the Sahel Alliance nations breaking away from status quo and forming the alliance? And anything particular happened within their nations?
As I pointed out, it was just a collection of different things that were happening. It's the fact that these nations were dealing with different extremist groups that had been terrorizing the population, and the military in each state had the sense that the government that was in power wasn't able to effectively handle the problem, so they seized power and decided they were going to handle it themselves. It's the continued French colonial influence, which also played a role with the issues pertaining to these extremist groups, that because of the French military presence in these states and the fact that the French military presence didn't seem to be resolving the issue, that part of the frustration is that people in these states were seeing French colonial influence, but they weren't seeing any benefits coming out of it. For example, as I pointed out, the justification for having a French military presence in the Sahel states was this idea that the French were going to help to fight these different extremist groups. And when it didn't appear that progress was being made on that front, it became another example of why these states felt that they needed to engage in a radical change and move in a different direction, because the status quo hadn't been working. The status quo was not resolving the issue of the extremist groups. Also, the issue of poverty, underdevelopment, the frustration that the governments that were in power weren't really doing enough to address these issues, the frustration that the Western states weren't doing enough to assist these nations with their development. So it was a collection of different issues that had been formulating in not just the Sahel, but in West Africa and across Africa for a while. The main focus of this discussion has been the alliance of the Sahel states. But when we look across Africa more broadly, we see that these issues are taking place throughout the African continent. Frustrations over the colonial influence, frustration over lack of security, lack of stability, frustrations over lack of development. It's leading to a lot of mass protests across Africa, and it's leading to, in some situations, even outright revolutions and rebellions. We've seen within the last decade, several dictatorial governments in Africa have actually been toppled through popular mass uprisings and even attempted mass uprisings. As I pointed out in Togo, I've been involved in the struggle in Togo. So really, the issues that led to the development of this alliance between the Sahel states are issues that we see confronting all states in Africa to one degree or another. So it's difficult to pinpoint one or even a handful of issues that led to this. It's a collection of many different issues that have been taking place in Africa for a long time.
Very good. Brother LMA, how you doing today?
Hey, what's going on, Lumumba? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine.
Yeah, to the topic, I'm kind of, what's the one I'm looking for? Cautiously excited about, kind of share the same sentiments as Brother Dwayne. I remember saying this years ago, like the type of personality that you need to fight a revolution is not necessarily the type of personality you need for a statesman. Like I said, you need. It's kind of like you need to.
Brother, you coming in cooking? Okay, I hear that.
Yeah, man. It was I don't know if you remember that Super Bowl commercial when they had like the farmers or whatever, and they'll talk about how the farmers needed to be strong enough to untangle a calf from a wire, but it needs to be soft enough to be able to give birth to a baby. Something along those lines. But you got to be strong enough to fight off the obviously your extremists, the what's it called, the I don't know if they're Islamic extremists that you were talking about. You be strong enough to fight them, strong enough to fight off French and European incursions, but you got to be soft enough to allow your people to breathe. But you got to be smart enough not to fall for any of the tricks that the West is going to try to play on, try to control the narrative and have them become, the bad guy. Let's say, you're trying to set up, you're trying to protect your revolution, but that means you got to crack the heads of a couple of, troublemakers and miscreants, but then not to allow the West to try to create the narrative that, oh, he's killing his own people. Like, no, he's trying to save his people. You just got a couple of knuckleheads that don't represent the people that need to be put in line. So I'm hopeful for them. But I guess my question is to you two. Do you think that the conflict between basically the West and I guess the East at this point, America and Europe and China, Russia and Israel and all these other guys, do you think if these two were to get into, let's say we actually get into World War III, do you think that would create the type of what's the word I'm looking for, distraction that the Sahel could use to actually solidify, proper leadership, or will the fact that these guys become more desperate that they'll begin to grasp on to Africa harder? I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going here. I guess if we talk about purely in economic terms, we're talking about the battle between the global North and the global South, right? If we look back at World War II, Africa played a preeminent role, right, in that battle, not only in terms of resources, but also as a strategic landing point, right, for not only the Axis, but also the Allies. I think of some of the battles in North Africa between General Montgomery of the British and, of course, Rommel of the Nazis, right? And so the Nazis being defeated at the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt, right? And then, of course, the British being able to take control of the Suez Canal. So a number of issues there. We can even talk about even some of the German massacres and Holocaust, I think, in Namibia, right? And so we see that Africa's always played a prominent role, particularly because of the resources, but also as a strategic landing point. So I think those are issues as well. I don't think that if there was a war, that Africa would somehow be pushed to the periphery and would not be an issue of concern. I think when we talk about the State Department, we talk about the KGB, we talk about those in Beijing, they all keenly have their eyes on Africa, and that's not going to change. They may have to divert attention to other issues, but I think they're always going to have a focus on the African continent, not only because of strategic value, but also because of the wealth and resources that the land provides as well.
Yeah, that was just my thoughts, because I was hoping that, like I said, if I don't think anyone necessarily has, because you have like superpowers that have beef with one another. United States has a beef with, Russia and China. Taiwan has a beef with China. Israel has a beef with everybody. And I'm hoping that, and no one's really, but I can also understand that, I'm hoping that these countries will kind of, unalive one another and then leave the rest of the, and hopefully we'll be spared. You know what I'm saying? Because we always like to talk shit about the West, but we live in the West too. So whatever hell they catch, we're not going to be spared. So
right.
But yeah, one of my kind of my frustrations, and I'm not necessarily torn, but it's kind of a sad reality, especially like here in America with the ADOS and FBA movement. And I think I mentioned this before on one of your other panels. One of my frustrations with these movements is that they seem to have an anti-African, anti-Pan-African tilt to them, which I think is kind of, to me, unnecessary for the goal that they have in hand. If their goal is to improve the material well-being of the African American here to get reparations, I don't see why it's necessarily to make disparaging remarks about Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanism and Africa in general. Like I get that, it can be frustrating when African and Caribbean immigrants come to America and they, tend to have the same mentality as, the average Western white racist conservative. But that doesn't mean you throw away the whole diaspora. It's almost like your family. Like you can have a big family. You may not be able to get along with your brother, but you get along with your sister. You may have two cousins that don't like each other, but that don't mean that you can't be cool with the cousins. That's the way I look at it, at least with the Black diaspora. Just because believe it's South Africa and Zimbabwe, they kind of go at it with each other. Can you do you know about that, Brother Dwayne? Like I know South Africa and one of their neighbors.
Yeah. That unfortunately there's been a long history of xenophobia in South Africa for a number of reasons. We know oftentimes, and if I could just very quickly digress, and then Brother Dwayne is going to tap in. Like I always say, Brother Dwayne is my ideological big brother. And why I say that is because he's my teacher. Yes, I may be defending my dissertation in a little over a week, but he's the one who's truly educated me and brought me to the level that I am in terms of my knowledge of Pan-Africanism, the history and culture of our people. So a lot of these issues and pressures, in my opinion, are due to the economic issues that our people face, right? So, for example, and I'm going to try to string this together. When you talk about this concept of FBA and ADOS, and we're going to bring this back to the conversation, a lot of this is based on there's a belief that immigrants from the continent in the Caribbean are competing, with African Americans for jobs, right? For resources, economic resources. In South Africa, we know that South Africa is a developed nation, or at least semi-developed nation, some would argue, based on what research you're looking at. But we know that our brothers and sisters, Black people in South Africa, and we even did a show on 30 years post-apartheid, that the economic conditions for the masses of Black people in South Africa have not changed much, right? And some may be argue that the economic gap has expanded between whites and the majority of Black people in South Africa since the end of apartheid. So those type of economic conditions cause people, in my opinion, to focus on the here and now, what's right in front of them, rather than looking at issues regarding the greater good, right? And so I think that's something that we could be cognizant of when we talk about, even in the Black community here in America. Unfortunately, many individuals will turn to selling drugs or crime as a way to feed their family, rather than thinking, hey, this is a short-term problem, but if I engage in this type of decision-making, it can create a long-term problem where I'm removed from my family for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So I think those type of pressures, economic pressures, lead to the type of lack of political alliances that are needed and necessary for us to grow and develop as a people on a global level.
And but the point I was kind of, frustrated with, because like I said, it's just, this is, I think a good thing for all of the African diaspora, and that we should all be kind of getting behind them. But, and don't get me wrong, I understand that, from the ADOS point of view, like I said, I can understand that your frustration with some people who come over here to have a, negative mindset, negative idea of Black Americans. It's not the whole.
I'm sorry, very quickly, Brother LMA. Here at Lumumba Speaks and Beacon Network, we use the term African Americans, not Black Americans, right? And there's a reason for that. We know that African Americans are the only racial ethnic group in which a racial or color is used to identify us rather than a land of origin, right? You're talking about Mexican American, Honduran American, Italian American, German American. So we want to use ethnicity rather than, of course, race. So just no disrespect, but we use the term African American here at Lumumba Speaks.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I wasn't trying to.
I know.
Anyway, but yeah, African Americans. Got my point now. But basically, and like when stuff like this happens, I don't want to, like I said, even if you're going to be ADOS, you can at least operate in such a way that you leave the door open so that, when something like this happens, where you have, people in Sahel, they raising hell, and now.
Go ahead, brother. You stopped on us.
Some charlatan with a big mouth gets online and starts talking shit about other countries, rather than saying, hey, these individuals that are coming to this country are a problem, but we're going to still keep the door open.
Understood. And does anyone provide veggie back or retort to what Brother LMA had to say?
Yeah, I think that's also connected to what brother was saying about South Africa, and it's not just ADOS, and it's not just South Africa. There's a history of African people engaging in this type of behavior, in which, because due to a sense of powerlessness, due to a sense of being unable to address the issues that impact our community, we tend to scapegoat other people. we see that in South Africa, that because of the historical legacy of colonialism, apartheid, white minority rule and domination in South Africa, it created a situation where, people in South Africa lash out against African immigrants because it's an easy target. They can go after these people. They can, attack these people. It's a bit more difficult to go after people who have real power and real wealth. It's the same thing with ADUS and FBA and those groups. It's easier to lash out against African immigrants from the continent and from the Caribbean because they don't have any power. So they're an easier target. It's easier to fight them than it is to fight the white supremacist system in the United States. And we see the same thing throughout the Caribbean as well, that even in the Caribbean, there's a problem of xenophobia. There are problems where people from one island might feel they're superior to an African from another island. And, really what it amounts to is because that you can't resolve your own issues, because you feel like there's a sense of powerlessness because you can't confront the people who are really responsible for your condition, you go after an easy target. And part of what's connected to that is that legacy, or the feeling of these people are coming here to take certain jobs from us, they're taking certain privileges, they're taking things away from us. And the reality is you didn't have those things before the immigrants even started coming there. South Africa, with or without other African immigrants, would still have a lot of issues with wealth inequality, poverty. Throughout the Caribbean, Caribbean nations would still have those issues with or without immigrants. Particularly here in the United States, we know African Americans have been catching hell long before the number of Caribbean and African immigrants that are here. So it's not a new problem for African Americans. It certainly didn't begin when Africans started immigrating from the continent. So to me, it's an attempt to scapegoat another group of people, and ultimately it leads us away from confronting the real people that need to be confronted. And that's why the Sahel Alliance is so important, because these are Africans who recognize the common enemy and are unifying to confront that common enemy. They're not fighting among themselves. They're not running away from the responsibility to truly confront the problems that need to be confronted. And I think very often xenophobic minded Africans are running away from confronting the actual issues that need to be confronted.
But a D1. Oh, I'm sorry. Go right ahead, LMA.
No, I was just saying I kind of lost my connection, so I caught the most of that. But yeah, I kind of agree. I hope yeah, I'm good. Yeah, you guys can go ahead.
But a D1, go right ahead.
Hey, what's up, guys? Yes, I was able to pop in because I'm at work right now. But yeah, so I'm just basically just kind of reiterate what I was saying in the chat, that I'm cautiously, kind of like most of us on the panel, like we're cautiously optimistic about the coup countries. But to me, my biggest concern, given like my own reading of what happened in the Saqqara era, that these coups can potentially be reversed because of the existing French interest that is already in the country, where the CFA franc and the different businesses and all the infrastructure that's controlled by France already can lead to a reversal of the coups. And also recently, if you guys haven't heard, is that there have been like, I think recently as like last week or 2 weeks ago, there was another coup attempt against Ibrahim Traore again, like it's like the fifth or sixth time. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. That existing players are not just only the civilians within the overall economy, but also people within the military junta actively collaborating with French and foreign interests to continue on thing. And I think the same thing happened in other coup countries also. So that's the main thing concerned. And then the flip side of that, what Dwayne was saying earlier, is also concerned that if the idea between democracy and having a military junta is also a thing, because yes, you want to remove the collaborating forces within the government under that supposed democracy, but also you can't also slip into an authoritarian type situation with the military junta if it's not ruled correctly and stuff like that. So that's also my general concern about the thing. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but very concerned about it slipping into a Lumumba type situation. I'm not Lumumba, sorry. A Sankara type situation where the French will come back and be able to reassert their interest again.
Great point. Mr. Sandman.
Hello, can you hear me good?
Yes, sir. Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, so I can't stay real long because I'm trying to run an errand real quick, but I'll be back in a half hour or so. But right before I start, I wanted to say that have you guys ever played chess before?
Yes, I'm an avid chess player.
You a chess player? Oh,
And,
okay.
real quick, I like to talk trash. So my custom-made trash talk, I would smack everybody here on the panel in a game of chess. All right, go right ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, shoot, we got to get online and play one more time, a few times and stuff like that, because I got a little skill. But they say that a pawn on the chessboard can be a very valuable piece, but you have to sacrifice it, right? So when you look at the situation in the Sahel, right? Um, so Iran, the United States is trying to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The Sahel region um, is full of enriched uranium. Okay, Russia, the United States is giving Ukraine weapons to fight Russia, and Russia is in turn giving weapons to the Sahel to fight the West. So, and if Iran launches a nuclear weapon against Israel, you know, all heck is going to break loose. That's World War III right there, right? So, what exactly is going on here? Is the Sahel region getting themselves, or is Russia using the Sahel region to enrich uranium to start this nuclear World War III? Are the people, the generals that are on top of those military coups in the Sahel region aware of what Russia might be attempting to do in regards to World War III in Iran?
Can I
So
respond to that?
yeah, go ahead.
Or Lumumba, you want to respond first? Or
Go right ahead.
well, from my perspective, what the Russians are doing is that I don't think it's a World War III situation that they're trying to gauge for. I think mostly what they're trying to aim for by supplying weapons to the Sahel is to get access to those raw materials, whether it's uranium or other resources, so that they can further their own economic development. I don't necessarily think it's a military alliance or they're trying to, send Russian troops in large masses outside of like the paramilitary group that I forgot the name of the group that they have, but some of those small groups of people. I don't think it's a military alliance or they're trying to set up a World War III situation. I think it's more just about getting resources so that they can continue financing their development, stuff like that.
Yeah, because from my understanding, I'm not sure, but France was initially trying to dig up that enriched uranium in the Sahel region, but the military leaders in those regions kicked France out because they weren't, purchasing the enriched uranium. So what's going on here? So they don't want the West to have the enriched uranium, but they want Russia to have the enriched uranium, and they're just going to trade it for arms. And then at the same time, the the Russians are giving weapons to Islamic extremists in the Middle East. So, and the same Islamic extremists in the Middle East are the ones that are uh, creating coups in West Africa by attacking the countries in West Africa with jihad. So, what's really going on?
Well, from my reading and understanding of it is that most of what the coup countries are doing, like Mali and Nigeria, who have those uranium things, they're trying to get access or control over those resources so that they can do trade and stuff like that. Use some of the uranium to create natural energy, cheaper, efficiently at home, and then also to export it, kind of similar to like other countries that does it. I think Uzbekistan did a similar thing too, where they kind of replaced France's uranium supply
Okay, I have
in the
to
short term.
roll real quick, but I'll be back in the few, Lumumba and panel. Thanks for letting me in.
All right, man. You there, Lumumba?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
basically, just to respond to what Sam is saying is that basically, from my perspective, what they're trying to do or attempting to do is to get back, is to nationalize those natural resources that was under French control, where they were getting basically pennies on the dollar for the resources that's being extracted from these from Niger or Mali or Burkina Faso, stuff like that, and then they're going to use it for internal development, not necessarily to give it to the Russians and stuff like that. But that's at least that's from my reading and understanding from reports I've seen over the last year or so. But yeah, that's what I think is been. But the problem is that kind of like what Dwayne was saying earlier, is that and this is more my perspective, is that if you focus too much on the military fight or just trying to fight off the jihadists, you're going to be consuming most of your foreign currency or your resources in order to buy weapons and resources to be able to continue to fight a war, but at the same time, you don't have enough industrial development to provide the material needs of the people, which is, I think, is the most important long-term issue. So it's kind of like a dual issue, conflicting issue, where you have to fight off these things too. You have to fight off these Arabized jihadists to establish security and stability within the region. But then on the flip side, have to have those resources to be able to foster internal development to provide the material needs of the people, like Mumumba said earlier. So it's a dual issue and a conflicting issue. So yeah, so that's why that's kind of my take on that on the thing with the Russians and all that.
It says Russia gets more than enough uranium from Kazakhstan. Also, nobody enriches uranium in the Sahel.
That's not true.
Okay.
On the last part, no, that's not true. But because France was actively enriching those uranium, using it for their natural energy. Because from what if I could find an article on it, they were using the uranium for like the last decade or 2 decades, using it not only for internal, like to provide energy for lights and electricity in France, but they were also exporting it to Germany and the EU as a for profit also too, using the uranium from Niger and and Mali. So yeah, for sure. The last part I think is incorrect on that, but the first part about the Russians getting it from Uzbekistan, that could be possible also.
Okay, very good. Any other thoughts? We're having a productive conversation this afternoon. Go ahead, D1.
Yeah, the only thing I would just say is that we could. I hope we could continue staying in solidarity with the brothers in the Sahel, because I even have my own song idea that I'm trying to work on with a brother from Senegal in solidarity with the brothers in the Sahel region. But again, without a strategy of how to deal with the current threat of the Arabized jihadists and then in the long-term thing of being able to build an industrial base to provide the material needs for the people on an everyday basis, on a day-to-day basis. Without that balance, I think it may run into problems. And then also at the same time is that there's existing, in my opinion, French interests, economic interests that reside in these regions, the people like the local oligarchs and all of that stuff, in my opinion, who's going to continue financing these coup attempts in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso as a way to covertly get people like Ibrahim Traore out of power and probably replace them with another. What's the name of the guy who took over after Sankara?
Blaise
Compaoré, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I think. That's what I'm concerned about. Like they're trying to eventually replace them with another one. But thankfully, at least in this time period, is that Sankara was kind of on his own at that time period. But this time, at least there's 3 countries and at least an alliance and theoretically working with them. And another point before I finish off is that another concern I have, immediate concern, is like the neighboring countries. Like let's say like Senegal, Guinea. Like, cause not Senegal, because Senegal is not wasn't a coup country, but Guinea, Togo, Benin, and I think Chad some of these kind of the imperial revolutionary, but some of the elites were in fact with like in power since like 1967, and then they put in some like their cousin to replace them as leader and stuff like that, and they continue in doing business with the French and stuff like that. So that's another external issue or periphery issue, I think, with these types of like, because they're basically surrounded. To me, they're surrounded by potential hostile powers. And I forgot Nigeria also too. So yeah, ECOWAS essentially. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. Yeah.
Okay, very good, very good. Brother LMA, Brother Dwayne, any thoughts? No?
No, I think we kind of hit all the points. Like I said, I think the main thing is we're all just cautiously, optimistic. We don't want to jinx it. We want to
Right.
make sure that these guys can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I mean, 'cause like I said, this opportunity really only comes along, and that was another thing I was thinking of. Just in general, like when it comes to Black liberation. I mean, it's just so many things that we have to get right in order to succeed.
Right.
We get the West, white supremacy, whatever, they can be wrong and foolish, 99 times, and they got to be wrong 100% of the time to lose. We have to be right 100% of the time just to win. So we're all optimistic, but it's a lot. Just from their standpoint, it's a lot they have to get right to so that region can be liberated, be free, be able to operate for their own prosperity and under their own ideals. It's a lot for them. It's going to be a lot for. It's going to take a lot for them to get it right. So
I like to. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's this like metaphor, like a phrase I like to use, is that we're basically starting at like to use a sports term, is that we're basically starting at the zero yard line, basically trying to move the ball up the field to try to get just a touchdown. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of how I see it. So that's why just basically like what LMA was saying. We're basically at the 0 yard line, and we're trying to inch our way yard by yard to be able to have successful development to address the material needs of the people. But there's so many dual issues going on that's causing, those type of, that's why you have this hesitation, cautiously hesitation, cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, but to take your analogy further, it's like our quarterback is missing an eye. The O line is underweight. The wide receiver has a broken thumb. It's we are we just don't have it. You got to think about it.
Great point, man.
Western powers and white supremacy, they've been at it. Because like I said, the way I look at it, like before they weaponized gunpowder. I mean, the Europeans. I mean, they spent centuries literally killing each other and perfecting the art of violence and war and sabotage and espionage. They perfected it on themselves. And then as soon as they weaponized gunpowder and they have their naval power, I mean, they can take the show on the road. And so now they're coming into regions where people, I'm not saying that other parts of the world didn't have conflicts or everyone was just some peace-loving, but they just were not ready for the type of savagery that was coming their way. You know what I'm saying? It's one thing for them to be savage. It's another thing for them to stab you in the back, hand a knife to your friend, and then tell your family members that it was a friend that killed you. You know what I'm saying? We just were not ready for that type of conniving violence, that the rest of the world has. And it's like, we're down. We don't, we've been on the receiving end, but I just don't know if enough of us have been on the receiving end enough, but not just taking the abuse, but learning how they. It's almost like when you're a kid, right? Your mom's spank you or whatever. For a while, you're just getting beat. But after a while, you kind of.
You're breaking up on us there.
You dropped out.
Ah, man, damn it.
Go right ahead. Last thing you said was, your mother's giving you a whooping.
Yeah. Nah, his connection might be a little bit off.
Okay, yeah,
But
yeah.
but
Hopefully
yeah,
he's back.
but what he said was correct though. But to give our ancestors a little bit of credit is that they were able to win a majority of these fights until like the 18th century or
Right,
the
we're talking
19th
about to
century
the
because
creation of the Maxim gun.
yeah, because it was only up until that point until like the mid 1800s is that's when they were able to finally defeat our ancestors
Absolutely.
successfully. So just to give our ancestors a little bit of credit, between the 1500s up until the 1800s, we did successfully beat them for the most part, outside of like the slave trade and stuff like that. But yeah, so what the brother LMA was saying is true though. But that we shouldn't get too discouraged because it hasn't been that long. You know what I'm saying? Historically speaking.
Correct. And very quickly, Defender of Logic, he posed a question to me. If you were in the position of Ibrahim, what would you do? So one, I think it's a bit difficult, right? I'm not running government, so I'm on the outside looking in, trying to say what I would do, kind of playing armchair president or head of state. But what I would say is I would seek to continue to develop and strengthen my
Word to Huey.
I'm sorry?
Word to Huey. Huey Newton. Huey Newton, remember?
Oh yeah,
armchair.
Okay, got you. I would work to continue to strengthen not only the military alliance with the other Sahel nations, but also economic as well. And I personally, and this would be because I'm a student of Thomas Sankara, will look to actually emulate the practical reforms that Thomas Sankara made during his administration to address the material needs of the people in Burkina Faso. So I hope that answers your question, Defender of Logic. As you know, the link is in the description. The link is in the chat. You can tap in and be part of the conversation as well.
Hey, Mabuma, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you just fine.
Yeah, I think I dropped out. I was the point I was making. Hopefully, I'm not repeating myself too much. But the point I was trying to make is, it's one thing to be on the taking the abuse and not learning from it. But it's better to, if you're going to take the abuse, at least learn the pattern. So one day you can, get from under the thumb of oppression. I was making the analogy about, when you're a kid and your mom's, spanking you, when you're a kid, you just can take it, right? But then, obviously get to a point where you become old enough where it doesn't quite, it doesn't quite hurt as much, but then you can start dodging. You can start maybe grab her hand or whatever. So it's a, silly analogy, but it's the point is that, at some point you have to be able to grab the slave captor's, wrist when he's whipping you, and be able to fight back. So that's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, and to add what you were saying, I think more importantly, people like historians like Dwayne and the information you provide, Lumumba, the information that you guys help us provide, help further our knowledge on how to correct those issues that we had historically in the past, and how to fix them, and how to create a path forward to fix them, and to have a development strategy, a security strategy to be able to facilitate what we're talking about here. So that's important also too. So just to add to what LMA was saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So let's see here, Brother Haru, Ibrahim can also learn from Mao of China. Okay, so tap in, tell us how so, right? Hopefully you can tap in, be part of the conversation, let us know how so you believe he can learn from Mao of China. I'm aware that Confucius stated you can learn from anyone, but we also want to make sure that we're doing things from an African-centered or Pan-African frame of reference. Snapshot Review says, are the leaders of the Sahel Alliance able to think about Pan-Africanism in its wildest terms, or would they be preoccupied with their immediate needs? So hopefully you could tap in, because I would like to know, what do you mean by wildest term, or do you mean widest term? So definitely hope you can clear that up as well.
To answer this question, or does anyone want to answer the question first?
Go right ahead.
Well, to me, I think the way nations operate, they always operate first on self-interest first, to address the material needs of the people first, but also within the context of Pan-Africanism, and when it comes to development, each nation, when you look at them at the micro level, they don't necessarily have the necessary resources or the raw materials or stuff like that to be able to finance development on their own, because all of these nations don't have the same capabilities that Congo has. Like, let's say if Congo wasn't currently under attack, but all of these nations, whether it's the Sahel or not, they need also other resources, other human capital to be able to do it. So yes, to answer his question, I think first, yeah, these nations is probably going to focus on themselves first, but also from a Pan-African perspective and from a geopolitical perspective, they're going to, it would be wise for them to be able to extend trade amongst their neighbors in the Sahel region and in Central Africa, abroad, to get the raw materials to be able to build the machines and the technology they need to be able to fight their short-term needs. I'm sorry, not fight, but be able to provide their short-term needs and the security and stuff like that. So to answer that first one. The second question. You can go ahead, Dwayne.
Brother Dwayne, were you going to tap in?
No, I mean, at this point, I'm just sitting back and enjoying the discussion. I think for the most part, I've said just about everything I think I could say on the topic. But I mean, to answer that question, I think from what I've seen from the leaders of the Sahel states, I think in the short term, I mean, obviously you need to address your immediate needs. You need to stabilize your situation, secure yourself where you're at. So I think in the short term, most of what they're going to be doing is going to be addressed to the immediate needs of those three states. But I mean, just the fact that they've even put together this alliance, I think what that suggests is that they recognize there is a need for international unity among African people. So I think depending on whether or not the Sahel Alliance can accomplish its objectives, I think to the extent that they're able to do that, at that point, then they'll start thinking about building a wider Pan-African movement. And I think the other aspect that we need to think about is, as I pointed out, there's a possibility that their initiatives could spread throughout the continent. Then at that point, I think you might start seeing it becoming a wider effort. But right now, I think the concern that the Sahel Alliance might have is that these are three states that are surrounded by other states in West Africa that might not necessarily be on the same trajectory. As I pointed out, ECOWAS's initial reaction was to essentially try to intimidate these states into changing direction. And when that didn't work, you see ECOWAS is trying to bring these states back in. So, I mean, if I was in that position, I wouldn't trust ECOWAS. I don't know, what ECOWAS is, trying to do. There might be some type of ulterior motive behind why they're switching position now. So I think ECOWAS has proven that they're not trustworthy. And I'll bring a little bit of Marvel comics into this. I always recommend to people who enjoyed the Black Panther movie to watch the BET series. Years ago, BET did a 6-part series, and the reason why I'm mentioning this is that in the BET series, which is based on the comics, the reason why Wakanda is isolated from the rest of Africa is because the Black Panther doesn't trust other African leaders. He knows that the African leaders that border Wakanda are compromised, and that they're working in the interest of Western states to destabilize Wakanda for Western purposes. So I think we see a similar type of thing with the Sahel states, that at the moment it'd be very difficult for them to broaden their Pan-African vision because they may not necessarily be sure that they can trust the states that surround them. And in that type of situation, you do have to secure yourself immediately. And I think as I pointed out, I think when they could accomplish their objectives, and I think if the vision and the ideas for what they're trying to do start to spread, then at that point they can engage in a wider approach to Pan-Africanism. But Thomas Sankara, he pointed out himself that essentially what he was trying to undertake, he was alone in doing it, and it became very easy to take him out because he didn't have the support that he needed. And it was something that he was aware of. In an address he gave to the OAU, he said if he's the only one taking the stand that he's taking, he may not be around to address the next meeting, and he wasn't.
This is very true. Absolutely. Yes.
And to add what Dwayne was saying, it's like what I just said earlier, like Benin, Togo, even Senegal to a certain extent, these sort of Western French proxies is going to create that particular problem for the Sahel region. That's exactly what I was saying.
Very good. Very good.
Unless there's more comments in the chat, I think I think it's been a productive discussion. I think we've hit all of the most important points.
I would agree. I would agree.
But as I pointed out, I think, for me, just the main thing as a Pan-Africanist, it does inspire a sense of optimism just to even see what these states are attempting to do and how they're going about doing it. So I think I'm very encouraged by what I see them doing, and I'm encouraged by the support and reaction I'm seeing throughout the continent. So I just think we need to really be on top of the situation and to support what they're doing however we can, and not just them, but support other initiatives and efforts on the continent as well. As I pointed out, I think they'll be in a better position to succeed when their ideas and visions begin to spread throughout the continent and they have the type of support that they need. But as some of the panelists have mentioned as well, I think we do need to be optimistically cautious about what's happening because, as we pointed out, there are certain issues that do need to be addressed. I think we do need a transfer to a more stable civilian government. I don't think it's sustainable to have a prolonged military regime over a lengthy period of time. And the influence of foreign forces as well, the influence of what the United States and France and other Western powers might be trying to do. And also Russia's involvement as well. As I pointed out, I think African states tend to trust Russia more than the Western colonial powers. But that's not to say that Russia doesn't have its own objectives in terms of what they're doing. So I think there are a lot of external factors that could end up shaping what's happening as well.
Absolutely. Now, I also think, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that if the alliance actually is able to have sustained success, I believe that we will start to see a Western media approach that seeks to vilify not only the alliance, but also the alliance's leaders. And so, when we go back.
Good point.
Brother Malcolm, when he would say, listen, the media is a powerful entity. They have the power to make the guilty look innocent and innocent look guilty. So I think that's something that we need to be cognizant of as well. And why it's important that we seek alternative media as a way to actually learn information regarding what's going on with African people, irrespective of where we are throughout the world. I think a great example of that was with Gaddafi, and many people. I remember receiving calls. So I can turn my camera back on. Received calls from numerous individuals saying, "Hey, this guy's a Pan-Africanist. Why is he killing his own citizens?" And I had to break down the fact that even though Gaddafi wasn't, a gentleman by any means, right, but he actually was fighting against individuals in the nation that were paid, trained, and funded by the CIA to overthrow the administration. So these are things that we need to be cognizant of, and that, but once again, also understanding that just because the West is against someone doesn't mean that the individual that they are against are necessarily for African people and African people's best interests, because we tend oftentimes to, unfortunately, kind of believe that, hey, if the West is against them, then they're for us, and that isn't always necessarily the case. Brother Snapshot Review states, how is the currency performing in these nations? That I am not aware of. Are you aware of that, Brother Dwayne?
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, there's so many things going on in these nations that, to be honest, the currency is not something that's at the forefront of my mind. And where the leaders of the nations are concerned, I'm not even too sure whether or not currency is necessarily what they're thinking about. I think right now the main thing is just, security and trying to protect what they're doing. So I can't really speak to the currency. But, the point that you made about Gaddafi, I just want to add, this is why we need to be careful about the media and developing an independent approach, because we often forget that, when NATO engaged in the intervention, they vilified Gaddafi and they made it seem like it was a humanitarian effort to topple a brutal dictator. But the part we forget, the years prior to the intervention, Gaddafi was actually close with Western governments. That there was a period of time where, Gaddafi had moved closer to the West. He was actually, you mentioned the CIA. There was a period of time where the CIA was actually working with Gaddafi to help eliminate Gaddafi's enemies in Libya. Britain as well. Britain was working with Gaddafi, France, and with Britain, it became an issue where the former Prime Minister, Theresa May, actually, she had to apologize on behalf of the British government because it came out that Britain was also assisting Gaddafi with capturing and torturing his political opponents in Libya, and the British government initially denied it, but when the evidence came out, they had to apologize. So that's why it's important to develop an independent analysis, because if we're basing things based on anyone who is against the West is for us, what happens when leaders who are against the West suddenly side with the West again? And then when the West turns against them, are we going to keep flip-flopping and switching back and forth based on Western policy? Because Western policy is not consistent. It switches depending on what's in the interest of the West. So that's important to keep in mind as well, that Gaddafi wasn't always as hated by the West as he is. So we do need to be independent in our analysis.
Absolutely. And family, if you're watching, once again, you're watching a dual stream between LumumbaSpeaks.com and Black Empowerment Initiative, where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. And of course, Beacon Network, the Pan-African Social Media Extraordinaire, the home of African-centered news and information. And we're discussing, examining the Sahel Alliance and what it means for African people. If you're watching, make sure you hit the thumbs up button. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell as well. We're on the road to 10,000, 10K. We need to be at 10K. We're pushing Pan-Africanism. We're pushing Black Power. So we should be at what? 100K, if we want to be quite honest. So we want to make sure that, we're taking care of business. But a D1, go right ahead.
I wanted to address real quick that last comment about the currency in the Sahel country, in these Sahel the Sahel coup countries, because to me I don't think the currency really matters that much anyway. Kind of like Dwayne was saying, like these leaders not even concerned about it, because when you understand geopolitically that their currency is tied to the franc, it doesn't really matter because it's going to perform weak against the U.S. dollar or the European or the euro or the franc by default, because most of the country's assets and industry and infrastructure is owned by or in part by the French. So to me, just to answer that dude's question about the currency, I don't think it really matters. To be honest with you.
That's a good point. I think that's why they sought to actually create this alliance, because they're trying to move away from those neocolonial influences where they can actually control not only the politics but also economics of the other countries. And this is an issue that we know that has been taken, that is of significant importance throughout the African continent since the advent of course, the independence. So something to be cognizant of. So, family, I think we're going to get ready to call it a day. So I'll allow Brother Dwayne to give his final thoughts and Brother D1, and then I will close out.
Yeah, I would reiterate the main points of what I said, that I think we do need to be cautiously optimistic about what's happening, but we do need to be optimistic as well. I think it's very what we see happening in the Sahel states is a very important development in the Pan-African movement, and my hope is it'll continue to spread. And as I pointed out before, that obviously there's a lot of attention happening with these states because of the nature of everything that's happening, and because these brothers are actually in power. But it's important to keep in mind that this didn't just happen recently. That for years we've been seeing a shift towards a Pan-African vision that's seeking to liberate Africa from these neo-colonial influences. And to me, it's significant that Burkina Faso is involved in this effort, because when I trace the timeline of the efforts I'm seeing across the continent, I would start it 10 years ago, 2014, when there was a revolutionary uprising in Burkina Faso that actually overthrew Blaise Compaoré, the man who assassinated Thomas Sankara. So within the last decade, I think we've seen a lot of these efforts across the continent, these efforts to overthrow the neo-colonial ruling class and to implement a Pan-African vision that's rooted in the needs of the people of Africa. So this is an ongoing process, and it's much larger than just the Sahel states. It's something that we're seeing across Africa. I mentioned Kenya earlier in discussion. Kenya would be another state to keep an eye on in terms of the efforts that are being undertaken by the people there. So it is a broader continental-wide effort. So it's important to keep that in mind. It's not just the Sahel states. We're seeing these efforts taking place across the continent.
Yes, and to add on to close out, to me, if these movements are going to sustain themselves, they have to figure out a nice balance between security and economic development. Because if you continue depending on the Russians for weapons and using all of your your forex or your foreign reserves to get those weapons to continue to go to war. And all it takes is, like what Dwayne was saying earlier, is to finance a certain sector of the civilian population, or just an effort group to go start a civil war, and then you're going to have an extended war for more years, and to create further instability within these regions. So this is why I say that without that balance of economic development and security, you're going to be constantly at war with these jihadists, or these Arabized jihadists, like I like to call them, and it's not going to really go that far. So that's kind of like the what I want to end on. That it needs to be a balance of both. So before we just to close out and stuff like that.
Very good, very good. I appreciate that, brother D1. Appreciate you tapping in. You know, you're welcome anytime here at Lumumba Speak Online Network. Until next time, family, you all know what to do. Always bet on black. Peace.
A BB Fahudi.